Who says you need to be a boss painter to get good results? Pompous numpties is who. My name is Benji and this is Marvel Crisis Protocol's Captain Marvel Speed Painting Guide for the Casual Painter. Now what will become apparent throughout this sermon is that I am not a pro painter, but one thing I do know is that the learning curve to make a miniature look good on the tabletop is not as daunting as you might fear. So let's try and find the right balance between speed and quality together. At the core of this guide and what we'll be using is the Citadel Contrast Paint range, which in most cases allows you to get the same effect as applying a base coat and a wash all in one go, bringing speed painting to a much wider audience. But because you might already have or prefer a different range of paints, we'll pop the names of the closest equivalents up on screen as we go. First things first then, you need to prime your model. We're opting to use the complimentary Wraithbone spray can as it gives a more natural and organic look when the contrast is applied. Of course, if you plan to use a different type of primer, make sure it's a white or off-white because these paints do not work on darker tones. The first colour on the paintbrush though is some Blood Angels Red. Applying a moderate amount of paint on the shoulders is fairly straightforward, but note the stripes that work up to the collar are left unpainted. And just watch out for pooling on the gloves and be sure to quickly identify where the border between red and blue is on the feet before you apply the paint. Finally, the sash then is really easy to apply when it's away from the body, but there are definitely some tricky bits to get to on the reverse side around the back. Just be patient, but don't worry too much if you make mistakes, as we'll just go back over it with some paint pot Wraithbone afterwards. You'll see we also chose this colour to emphasise the lips, which will darken back down in a later step. Iyanden Yellow is up next for the striped part of the costume below the shoulder area we just painted, the straps that meet the collar, and also the Captain Marvel star symbol on the chest. We're also covering the whole of the buckle, including the raised part, but don't worry, we'll lighten that bit later. Next up was an optional step, which was the eyes, a horizontal line of white scar for the whites of the eyes, and a vertical strip of Abaddon black, with the smallish brush to hand, and Mr. Magnifying Glass if you can, should get the job done. We then had every intention of using the slightly less contrasty Iron Jaws yellow on the hair, as we wanted it brighter than the yellow already used, but it just didn't provide enough depth in the recesses, so once that dried we went back to old faithful Iyanden Yellow, which is where we and should probably have started and finished for the Barnet. The go-to for this type of flesh tone is your Guilliman flesh, and here a nice even coating goes over the whole face and exposed neck, even over the eyes and lips we've already painted. Just be wary of pooling, especially in the recesses of the eyes and around the ears. Talasar Blue is normally always a good choice for comic book characters, and here is no exception. And for the first time in the model you can afford to put a decent sized dollop to work on all the remaining bits of the costume that have yet to be painted. Probably the easiest and most gratifying step to finish off the body, but just remember, although you should use healthy amounts of paint on larger surfaces, much like you would with a wash, contrast paints don't respond all that well to touching up on the flatter surfaces, so just leave your attention fixed on areas of egregious pooling and have confidence in the outcome once dried. A little splash of lead belcher was applied to the crate on the base then, which needs absolutely no more voiceover. And then it was my go-to for concrete bases, Basilicanium Grey, applied in bulk and even more like a wash when on completely flat surfaces like this. You can of course cover the sides of the base with the same paint, but don't expect an artistic marvel to stare back at you once done. And there you have Captain Marvel tabletop ready in no time at all. Yes, contrast paints can require some getting used to, but they're still an excellent tool for casual painters. However, whilst that might satiate your needs, we're going to continue with Captain Marvel on the paint station and add a few highlights and finishing touches to the model, with some non-contrast paints. Again, nothing too excessive in the spirit of this video, but for just a little extra effort, we can get some nice results. Following a similar sequence to the contrast steps, we needed an orange to contrast with the red applied over the costume and sash. So we turned to a base paint Jacaro orange, which we applied to all the raised and more exposed parts of clothing, and the paint once dried came out more or less the way I'd hoped. Flash gets yellow was next on the bristles, covering the belt, the stripes across the chest quite liberally, and then a bit more pronounced on Cap's emblem, and the raised part of that belt buckle. I wanted a fair amount of brightness to the hair, and the Flash gets just about did the trick, although a further extreme highlight of white on the tippy of the raised parts would have been an option too. For our blue, we picked that of the Lothern variety for the costume, leaving a fair amount of paint on the model, as we're really not going for an edge highlight. That would need a further stage, so really we're just looking to bring a bit more pop and brightness back in. The face really can't be considered complete until Cadian flesh tone comes to town. Now whilst Guilliman flesh does an okay job with the skin, it's a little bit anemic when you're trying to mimic flesh, and so that extra layer really goes a long way. Just be mindful of the work you've already done on the lips and eyes. With the model proper done, all that needed finishing was the base, so a dry brush of Administratum Grey was applied all over the concrete. Just be even more wary with flat surfaces that you've got almost all the paint off the brush before your back and forth motion. Which left us with a light coat of lead belcher to go back over that metal grate with. Yes, we could have gone with a brighter silver, but my way does the job and allows you to use a paint you already did, so job's a good one. And that, as they say, is proof that you don't need to be an expert to get good results. I'm sure many of you will be happy with just the contrast paint steps, but it just goes to show what can be achieved with minimal time investment either way. Stay tuned for more speed painting guides. Alas, I've been the voice in your head, and this video has ended.